The UN is shut down today because we have so many of them here. I was going to rename this session today, Everything You Wanted to Know About the United Nations and Was Afraid to Ask. But we have a great lineup of folks. I would have sort of jokingly start and ask, in the next 75 years, can we do better on diversity, particularly gender diversity? But Rosemary, it's so great to be with you today. Thank you. So let me start and just lay out a frame for this discussion. Last year, the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, spoke here, and he basically gave a bleak picture of the times. Let me just raise a couple of things that he said. He said, we face enormous challenges that can't be solved by any country on its own. Number one, climate change, the defining challenge of our times. Two, migration and refugees, people on the move everywhere. Three, the multiplication of conflicts that are increasingly interlinked and which itself is linked to newer threats of global terrorism and international criminality. And four, the impacts of new technologies that are difficult to manage in all their dimensions. But he says there's an ultimate paradox in today's world because more than ever, multilateralism and international cooperation are under fire. Multilateralism is being questioned precisely when we need it most. The world is more connected, yet societies are becoming more fragmented. Challenges are growing outward, while many people are turning inward. So where are we today? And I'm going to start with former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon to just help give us a quick snapshot of if we were to just pull the plug on the United Nations today and just let it go. I mean, I would presume right now half the room are true believers in the UN, and let's pretend half the room are skeptics. So given these challenges that the Secretary General laid out last year, how would you make the United Nations, multilateralism, these challenges relevant to the skeptics in this room?
United Nations may not be a perfect one, but that is the symbol of the multilateralism. Since the end of Second World War, just not to repeat what we had seen, such a tragic destruction of humanity, and then world leaders came together to create this United Nations, the we the peoples, and that was the main philosophical, vision of the world leaders. Now that, as you say, as what my successor Antonio Guterres said, multilateralism is under fire. People say that under threat. It's really worrisome that the basic guiding framework since the end of the Second World War is now in disarray. When multilateralism, the main assailant, who was the designer and constructor of this world body, is now stepping away from Human Rights Council. Then climate change agreement, which was adopted in Paris. Then I do not understand what is the message. There is not a single country, however powerful, resourceful one may be, can do it alone. I think we have to pool all our wisdom and resources together.
But is that an answer? Because it sounds like you're criticizing about folks walking away from the Human Rights Council. But how do you push reset? I'm going to go to the president of the General Assembly now to ask Professor in just a moment about how to push reset. But the question is, well, before I leave you, Secretary General, you talked about the history and your lament that certain characters are not respecting
let me continue. Then we have to preserve and protect the international governance system. We have to do much more to make the United Nations empower the United Nations. Of course, the United Nations has been trying to be more accountable, more transparent, and more responsible. That is what we have been doing. Then everybody must work together. We have to make sure that climate change, Sustainable Development Goals with the 17 goals must be implemented to make sure that this world is better, more prosperous, more secure for our succeeding generation. I think that is a moral and political responsibility of the leaders of today for our succeeding generation.
Professor Mohammed Bande, I want to ask you, in your role now, and I heard you yesterday speak a bit of this, what do you think you're going to do in pushing reset for the next 75 years to win over the skeptics, not only in this room, but around the world, who have just said, you know, the United Nations used to have a role, the United Nations may have been great, but it's not doing much for us today?
Thank you very much. I think several things can be done. First is to ask the questioners, what are they doing themselves before we begin to ask what others are doing? If we believe in the system, as we must, then let each country operate on the basis of what it says it will do. Then it has a stronger reason and basis to now say others to do the same. Now, so it's not in every actor, every stakeholder has a role and must play that role responsibly. Now, we also have to remind ourselves that it's needed once in a while that, angry as we are, for good reason, that we are not doing as much as we should be doing. We have gotten more people out of poverty. We have gotten more people in school. People are better engaged around the issues. I mean, 10 years ago, we wouldn't have gotten young people around the world talking about climate change. Now we have gotten them to understand the urgency of the issue. It is whether you are talking of countering terror, and there are people who are better qualified to discuss with this. There are connections around the globe showing that, yes, even if there are people who are questioning this or that element, they are unable to disconnect from the system because we cannot see how. And I think to remind ourselves about what the United Nations has done, what multilateral organizations, not only the United Nations, have done to even bring home every day the notion that human beings are equal. The notion of rights, I think these are fundamental questions that we should always remind ourselves are around. They have become common because there is an organization that reminds and is insistent that this be the case. Thank you.
I know that in your campaign, that I read your campaign on what you were going to bring to the job, and you laid out 4 points that you thought that your leadership in the UN could change the game and shift. And I wonder if you could address this issue of inclusion and human rights and empowerment of youth and women more specifically, because I do feel as if that's one of the areas in the world where you feel a strong pulsating current. And I'm interested in the fact that you felt that that was something you needed to elevate to a higher level in the UN. Was there sort of a distance from that mission that you felt needed to be corrected?
No, I think it's not so much a distance. It is that this is a crucial element. The basis foundation of the modern world is the notion of rights and of equality. And whatever action we take that takes us away from this completely destroys the foundation. And that's why we must deal with inclusion. I mean, coming from a country that has non-colonial rule, you can understand the whole question why exclusion is a serious matter. So these are some of the issues that play into the issue of why are things important. And then look at what it has done when you end slavery, when you bring women into the fold, what remarkable things have happened because of these big ideas. And I think we should always come back to these issues because they animate what it is that we do.
Ibrahim Gambari, you're the former foreign minister of Nigeria. You are a true believer. I'll put you in the believer camp on the United Nations, but I know you're worried about its relevance, and you've been working with Madeleine Albright on that as well. What are the top of mind issues that you felt you needed to move forward to answer today's question of how would the United Nations make it another 75 years?
Well, I think, thanks for Steve for reminding me that I was foreign minister. That's ancient history. About 35 years.
You said that, not me.
But,
you look so young.
Well, don't be deceived by appearances. But seriously, though, here is the thing. We need to build a coalition, not just of the willing, but the coalition of the unwilling or the reluctant.
Of the unwilling?
And reluctant,
yeah,
you know. Because, and that's where I think Secretary General Ban Ki-moon was at another session today where he emphasized and agreed totally the whole global education for global citizenship. Catch them young. Let the younger generation realize because the adults often forget that none of the problems that are facing the world today, the climate emergency, the poverty, the violent extremism, can be solved except through multilateralism. So when the UN is under attack, when multilateralism is under attack, we should see that we are all under attack. That's why the private sector, the business community, the civil society group, NGOs must fight back, must push back on this attack on multilateralism, because it's impossible. Let me give you one example. They used to be taught that the issue of migration and poverty, that's an African issue, that the Europeans have learned now that that is not an African issue, because it's becoming much of their issue. I want to check the figures, but I'm told that right now there are about 2 million Nigerians that have the right of entry into Britain. So it's really in the interest of Britain to help Nigeria to become stable and prosperous, because guess what? God forbid the worst happens, not people who want to enter Britain, but who already have the right. And what is true of Britain is also...
So that's a bit of a warning, right?
A warning, but because you have to then work with everybody else to address the issue of migration, the issue of poverty, the issue of violent extremism, what it is that push people from outside.
So what you're suggesting is, I'm hearing, is that some of the nations that are ignoring their stakeholder response may need to be shocked.
Absolutely.
Shock therapy?
But they can avoid that by really seeing the answer, not a withdrawal from multilateralism, but an embrace of multilateralism.
Rosemary, I know that we're in Doha in Qatar, and so I want to be respectful, but in America we do occasionally have drinking games, so I'm particularly fine having orange juice drinking games. But whenever I hear the words multilateralism and governance, I feel like, oh, take another drink. They get thrown around a lot. They become sort of sludgy words, and people's eyes glaze over if they're not part of essentially the UN crowd or the crowd of, I would say a lot of my friends in the global justice world are very comfortable with that language, a lot aren't. You've been America's ambassador to the United Nations, and now you're Undersecretary General for Political Affairs. And I know that you're sometimes put under pressure to explain why the UN matters. Is there a way to make multilateralism and governance more Twitter-friendly, more fun, more sexy?
I don't know if I can make it more fun.
Yeah.
But what I can say is I think if we want to really reach audiences, we've got to speak their language. And the word multilateralism doesn't mean very much to an American. If you talked about rule of law, that means something. If you talked about saving the lives of young children who are under, risking in an area that's risking famine, that has meaning. So I think we have to think about it in terms of what is it we really do, and explain it in that way, because just coming together doesn't necessarily resonate with a lot of Americans. So that's one. The other thing is we really do need to be a much better job of telling our story. I think we're getting much better at it now, but there are a lot of things that the world does not know what happens behind the scenes at the United Nations. That we're not just resolving conflicts, we're not just working on Syria and Yemen and Libya and Somalia, but we're also preventing conflicts by the envoys we send to the field, by the interaction we have, good offices of the Secretary General. This is an important story, I think, to tell that people just don't know about.
When you take a job, any of you, I was going to go to, and I'll make sure we get everybody, but when you take a job in the UN, like you're doing now, and you had been our ambassador to the United States, Ambassador Voronkov had been ambassador for Russia to international institutions before, do you find it vexing to be both a public servant for the world as opposed to a public servant for America? Because I'm going to ask Ban Ki-moon for a minute. He's been giving a lot of his time in life to NGOs on climate change and raising, the temperature on NGO activities on that front. But we have members of the U.S. Congress that are not believers in science. We have certain people in the United States that are occupying the White House that are basically trying to ratchet down attention on climate change. But climate change is a major, as we heard from Mahathir Mohamad yesterday, climate change is very much on the agenda for the world. I just am interested in the personal human side of it. Do you feel vexed?
No. I don't feel vexed at all, and I didn't find it difficult to become an international civil servant. I actually started my professional career as an international civil servant. My first job was as a P2 at UNESCO in Paris. And I'm very happy to be back in the multilateral, I'll use that word, context again. I think that what one does here is representing the values of the United Nations, what it can do, and trying to explain to whether it be Americans or others, the need to understand what can be done and the tolerance that is needed in order to have peace with other countries.
Thank you. Ibrahim's jumping out of his seat.
Just two quick things.
Do it loudly.
Rosemary, by the way, took the job that I used to do, which is the exception that proved the rule about a non-Western person as head of political affairs at the UN. Two quick things. First, the language. It's often very difficult. Madeleine Albright, when she was ambassador of the United States to the UN, told us, other ambassadors, that she wanted to explain the UN and its values to Americans. So she went to the Middle West, and the town hall was going well until somebody said to her, I'm quoting her now, say, we are now more convinced about what the UN actually does. But the problem is, how come there are so many foreigners at the UN? Yes, you have to explain to the Americans, but you still have to, in many ways, explain the value of working together. And no matter how powerful or strong or rich that you may be, you cannot solve many of the problems that are facing us. So that's the point that I think is very important to always remember. Secondly, the UN, and I've spent 23 years there in various capacities, doesn't do prevention very well. We have to admit that. And to do prevention, conflict prevention, you have to engage other partners, because we are talking about rebuilding institutions. You have to, the women, the youths, the regional organizations, it's very, very important to get it. And that's why we are suggesting the Albright-Gambari report that would transform the Peace-Building Commission to a council so that it will be expanded. The permanent members should be members of the new Peace-Building Council with the power to audit behavior and to stress prevention through early warning and early action. So we should do conflict prevention better, which we are definitely not doing right now.
Mr. Secretary General, I know we're going to get to everybody, I promise. We'll get to you. But I want to come back to this question of reinvention. And you've reinvented yourself as president and chair of the Global Green Growth Institute, which is a Korea-based climate change NGO. You're also vice chairman of the Elders. And I guess, I happen to love the Elders. I like the Elders. But most people look at it as sort of this faraway group that sounds sort of, creepy or distant, or they don't know about it. And so I guess coming back to the question of reinvention and gathering those people who may be skeptical, what are you doing, what are the Elders doing to create that spark of purpose that I think many people doubt is there today in the United Nations?
The Elders was founded by President Nelson Mandela in 2007. It is about 12 years old. We have 11 elders who are former president or Nobel Peace laureates, and I'm one of the 11 elders. Of course, we have former leaders like President Jimmy Carter and Kofi Annan, who died, all their emeritus elders. Now, what we are doing, using our moral voice on every aspect of global challenges, all norms and values and ideals, which United Nations has been really trying to promote. Now the leaders in actual positions, they are very much restricted because of their narrow vision, short-term gains. But we are not in the government, not in the official position. We are much in a better position to speak out our minds and our spirit and our experiences and wisdom. We try to help regional conflicts, some smoothened, and try to help those leaders to address all these issues on the basis of humanity and global peace. At this time, then how we can fix all these problems? I'm asking the global leaders to have a more global vision, rather than their national vision. With the transformative development of science and technology, with the advent of the fourth industrial revolution, there is no such country based, no worlds. And we are living in a small planet Earth. We have to really care our humanity as well as our planet Earth. We have to have a wisdom to live harmoniously with our nature. That's what I have been speaking out all the times to the world's people. For that, we have to educate.
Thank you. Fabrizio, it comes to mind that the Elders was also partly founded by Richard Branson. And there's probably no better marketer in the world than Richard Branson. So as I'm thinking, part of what I'm asking is not only substantive, it's also about new gloss, pushing reset, figuring out how to reach people that are unreachable. You are the person in charge of the 75th anniversary. You're helping to guide the course. How are you thinking about both what the buttons you need to push on the 75th anniversary are, and what do you need to do on the marketing front?
I think the issue goes way beyond marketing, and I'm sure we're improving in that respect, as some panelists said. First of all, let me say at the outset that what the group you see up here are not representative of UN leadership. UN leadership is much more diverse, certainly gender diverse. The Secretary General has achieved by now over 50% women leaders in the UN, building on what was done before by Secretary General Barnes.
That deserves applause.
This is not the typical UN leadership you see before you.
Thank you for that.
Secondly, you talked about a spark of purpose. I mean, the real UN is out in the field. It's not us who sit at New York. Our job is really to support them, to keep the intergovernmental processes. The real UN, if you like it, is now in Yemen, is now in Syria, is now in the occupied Palestinian territories, risking their lives to make a difference for those who need us most. That is where the real UN is, and they're inspired every day by the spark of purpose of the Charter, by the spark of purpose of their mandates. So how do we get on? How do we get over the disenchantment that is real? And it's the disenchantment in lack of how we fall short of our own ideals. It's a growth in unilateralism, in bilateralism. It's a sense of multilateralism fatigue. I think how we get beyond that is reconnecting with we the peoples. The UN, and before it the League of Nations, were born at times of global catastrophe. They were equally times of major division. The Cold War followed very quickly after the Second World War. But there were common aspirations and common hopes and common fears. Common hopes for a secure future with no more global wars. Common fears about a return of such a war. We've lost touch with that, and we need to reconnect with those global aspirations and the global hopes. And today they're very much around the certainty of the future. Most of us, obviously not those living in conflict, obviously not the Palestinians in the occupied territories, but most of us have enjoyed a better life than our grandparents. But can we say that for the next generation? I don't think that's so clear. Our generation and the one before us have depleted the planet of species. We've taken climate change to the brink. We've invented incredible new technologies. But will they do more or less for equality? Will they do more for human rights or less? Will they do more for peace and security or less? Those are very open questions. And that's where we need to re-engage with people and draw on their aspirations, their hopes, as well as their fear, to re-engage the multilateral process. It's not the diplomats in New York who can do it. It's we the peoples, and that's how we want to mark UN 75, hearing from we the peoples, on their hopes and aspirations, on how we should get better, more critically. And I think the answers will be around a more inclusive United Nations, not just in terms of nationalities, but more inclusive in terms of bringing youth in bringing civil society in bringing business in.
Right.
And we really need to make the United Nations once again belong to we the people.
Before I jump to Vladimir and Achim, thank you so much for that roster of big ideas, but I want to push you a little bit further because you put some things on the table like technology and climate, and we're going to get to human development in a moment, and counterterrorism, but the big purposes that you laid out and really uncharted territory that needs to be charted. I think many Americans like myself who do support the United Nations are frustrated by the lack of ability to use the UN as a place where those issues can be brokered, talked about, and where frames are set. That you tend to see a lowest common denominator achieved, not a highest common denominator. And so I'm interested when you think about AI, for instance, facial recognition software, the way that's being used to control and corral people today. I would put that up as a, when we talk about chemical and biological and nuclear weapons, I happen to be at the Hill, I know when someone's writing this op-ed right now for us, they said there's a whole new area of a new kind of weapon against human beings that's coming potentially out of the technology area. Brad Smith, the president of Microsoft, just wrote a book about technology called Tools and Weapons. So my question to you, Fabrizio, because I really liked very much how you laid out an agenda, do you think the United Nations itself is the platform of that? Or does the United States need to be that? Does China need to be the platform? Does the UK? Does Nigeria? Where does these new frames get set in your future UN?
I think one of the challenges of new technologies is they're increasingly impacting on all countries, and yet the countries and the actors around the table has been limited to a fairly restricted group. So I think the Secretary General absolutely wants to make the UN not the director in any way of new technologies, but yes, a platform to discuss how they can be best steered, a multi-stakeholder platform that brings not just together member states, but also non-state actors. And that has happened in Geneva. There have been an important articulation of principles around lethal autonomous weapons. There are important meetings happening now. A group of
lethal
experts.
Autonomous, I mean, these are killer robots,
Well,
right?
yes,
they run themselves.
In the popular,
yeah.
They're weapons that can act and kill without human agency involved. And obviously, that's a huge moral,
China's a big
ethical
player in this.
issue.
The United States is a big player in this.
Well, in AI, not necessarily in those weapons. But of course, we need to articulate global principles that help steer new technologies to enhance our human rights, to increase opportunities for sustainable development, to foster peace and security, as opposed to doing the opposite. And the Secretary General wants to build on efforts already ongoing in the UN to make it a better platform for doing just that.
Thank you. Vladimir, I know when you came into your job, your office was created in 2017, and I'm sure that the world cheered when you took that job. Actually, I know the world was divided when you came into that job. Russia tried very hard to get you in that position, and the United States, Britain, Israel, others expressed reservations. Have you won any of them over yet?
First of all, thank you very much for this question, because this question is connected with your previous questions. United Nations is a body created by human beings. And because of that, of course, all positive features, negative features are the same as with regard to every human being. There are different periods in the development of a person, and the organization also is developing. And this is not something separate from the member state, from a member state. We have 193 member states, which creates, in real terms, the United Nations. So if there is a common political will to overcome all the difficulties, it could be overcome. You draw attention on this new office. Of course, this is a collective. This was the collective will of member states to create the office, because it was a common understanding that this is a common scourge, that universal tools should be found in order to be effective in tackling of this, to address this threat. And I think it's a very good base for compromise solutions. And the office proved that it's possible to work together. it looks like counterterrorism is the less contradictory agenda for the Security Council at this very moment.
So are the Americans and the British and the Israelis supporting you now?
You know, if we're speaking about the part of non-political part of our work, for example, support of
We'll leave, Rosemary, the political stuff, right?
yeah, support of victims of terrorism. This is absolutely a human rights issue. This is the issue. This is a growing number of people across the whole globe, and legislation, support of these people is utmost important for the United Nations and for many, many countries. Advanced legislation, financial support, creation of possibilities for these people to speak, to prevent, to tell their own story about this tragedy happened, to shift the attention of the international community from perpetrators, because each time we have the next terrorist attack, we know everything about a guy who did commit this previous day, but we know about nothing about victims, and this is the task for the United Nations, to concentrate on this human being story. So I think there is a lot of room not to politicize this agenda, but to make very practical, pragmatic job in order to be in line with the expectation with the majority of countries.
Before I jump to Akam, let me ask you, do you find, I guess when I was listening to Javad Zarif up here, and he opened with the question and the notion about zero-sum games played between the world's powers. And as I look at our new president of the General Assembly and your task, you know, I worry about you. I mean, it's going to be a tough job because when you look at the past of the UN, by nations like the United States, Russia, and China, and some others, it's been a platform where zero-sum games have nonetheless been pursued. When I look at the Nigerias and some of the smaller nations in the world, multilateralism has paid off. That was the game that paid off. So within the same building, you could have different strategies. And so I guess my question to you in this important role you have in counterterrorism, are you able, and it's a similar question I asked to Rosemary, are you able as a Russian attendant, a steward of that counterterrorism role, to demonstrate a commitment to multilateral ethic as opposed to being an agent for a state playing a zero-sum game within the United Nations?
Thank you. It's an excellent question. For example, in my office, I have 120 persons working for this counterterrorism agenda. They are from 65 countries. And to have a common reading, to have a common culture of action, it's also a very significant task for all of us. And it takes a lot of efforts to have common understanding what should be done in this international environment to be effective, to be in line with the expectations of member states. But we have universal instruments approved by all member states, like global counterterrorist strategy. And reading of these documents, one can understand how to deal with this kind of issues and how to be motivated to achieve.
Akam Steiner, if there is one part of the United Nations I see everywhere I go in the world, it's UNDP, the UN Development Program, focus on human development, so much tie into the Sustainable Development Goals. Tell us what your dashboard, in very brief form, what your dashboard looks like. Where are the human development moments that you're getting right? Where are the ones you're getting wrong?
Stephen, I'll respond to that, but you issued a challenge earlier on and encouraged us to be interactive with you.
Yes.
So just a brief question to you, perhaps at the end of the panel. You said when you think of some of the terms and issues we trade in the United Nations, your habit would be to take the next drink. So the question I want to pose to you is, what happened between you and the generation of your parents and your grandparents who actually were passionate about the idea of the United Nations? And the United Nations, I want to say this also as we look to the 75th anniversary, is not just an ism. It is actually a dramatically powerful idea. It is not an institution in the first instance, and it is also not just a bureaucracy, but the charter, the principles, the norms, the codification of international law have been extremely powerful and have been used by countries time and again. And that was the vision. And to some extent, remember the famous quote from Dag Hammarskjöld, the United Nations is not about getting you to heaven, but it is to protect you from ending up in hell. So I think it is important that we don't transact on the 75th anniversary the value or the perception of the United Nations as an institution, organization, whether it's the Security Council, the Secretariat, or UNDP, but we go back to this extraordinarily powerful idea that people have sometimes lost sight of, and then indeed judge the different consequences from there, whether they meet expectations. But I think it is important because we have ended up in a conversation where the state of the world defines the perception of the United Nations. Now, very briefly, you asked me, as the development program of the United Nations, well, we are a living expression of a fundamental conviction, the notion of solidarity, that in the end, the richer countries will also be better off if poorer countries are able to acquire the means by which to develop their economies, their nations. Outlook today, I have very little time, so let me say the Human Development Report that UNDP has just published for 2019 is one lens through which you can look at the state of play. Economic development, immense. The fact that we now have, across the world, a sense of disenchantment with political leaders, the institutions that represent us, and the outcomes of economic choices that have often been defined as successes, namely in GDP growth, in income per capita, and Gini coefficients, clearly are not correlating where people want to see some of the values that define societies thrive. And there are things that we have achieved. Development is an extraordinary success story over the last 200 years. But as we look forward, the advent of new technologies, climate change are great drivers of inequality. And if you ask me about two elements that we need to be concerned about, it is the ability both as nations, but as everybody on this panel has said also, as a community of nations to tackle them, because otherwise the risk to the future is extraordinarily high. And to my right sits Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. It is during his tenure that the world actually in 2015 came together remarkably to agree on what has become the Sustainable Development Goals, but actually was borne out, if you turn it on its head, on the risk map of the 21st century. The Sustainable Development Goals turned into risks, give you a lens on where the world is bound to work together, otherwise it will fail. And if you doubt this notion, then watch the evening news right now and see how people across rich and poor, large and small nations are reacting when they lose confidence in their leadership, in their institutions of government, and ultimately turn to what we then have to address, whether through a prevention, a crisis, a humanitarian response, namely the falling apart of societies. That's the prospect that we are not only addressing as the United Nations, but each nation in itself is struggling with.
Thank you. That's a great, I'm going to very quickly answer your question, and then I'm going to ask you all a zinger, and then we're going to go to the audience with the last few minutes that we have. But I'll tell you very simple. In my view, the kinds of things we built after World War II were generated to build higher and higher trust, more and more stability, and from a selfish, there's always selfishness, a bit in selflessness. And the selfishness of the United States, at least my family, was I grew up in Japan. I was sharing with Ban Ki-moon. I've been to Korea many times when I was in high school, because we were serving the world, but the America got a kind of payback. And that's where the reserves currency of the status of the dollar was. There were certain sort of quid pro quo dimensions, excuse the word quid pro quo, but there were dimensions of that where people felt they were winning by being globally engaged. And as globalism took over, globalism was another way to say we had higher and higher trust networks. You were moving people and ideas and institutions more rapidly around the world. That connectivity is there, but fear has been injected. And I'll go back to Secretary General Guterres' comments last year. He said fear is the new catchword of everything, and that there's a trust deficit disorder in the world, not only in this question, but everywhere. And I think that's what's happened generationally, is they feel that they've become disconnected, more fearful, walls are back, the Tom Friedman, Kenichi Omai, borderless world no longer exists. And that's what I think certain countries, at least the Western world, thought it was building. So that would be my answer, but we can have drinks about that later, orange juice. But let me just ask you, there's a great report here that I would recommend that people look at. His Excellency, the Foreign Minister, who I think was in here, as well as Ban Ki-moon, co-chaired a process called Reimagining Governance in a Multipolar World. And it's a Doha Forum report. I highly recommend you look at it. Much better than I thought it would be. And I'm interested, as you were given the task and I'm going to start with our new president of the General Assembly. But just one by one, very quickly, in just a few seconds, what would be the one or two most important things you would put into the basket of reimagining governance in the UN, of pushing reset, of adding luster to the institution and purpose? Just give me one or two things that we can share with the audience, and let's go through the room. Professor.
Yes, I think it's really the whole question of trust. That first, not only within member states, but also the real effort that has been made around the notion of working as one. We are not dealing any longer with simply the General Assembly, the Security Council, but really we are talking a language. In spite of the subculture that have developed over time, we are still developing a language of how we speak, relating to urgencies concerning conflict, concerning inequality. These are the issues.
Right. Secretary General.
The one area we have not touched as a way addressing the strengthening the global governance is how to deal with all this rising nuclear threat. We've been talking about climate and sustainable development, human rights. It has been all the discussions. Now, I'm deeply concerned about this cancellation of INF. Then all this architecture, which has been created between the nuclear power state, is now broken. Therefore, it will be important. Now, as elders, we have been proposing and suggesting to nuclear power states that what we call, they should take nuclear minimization agenda, which can be termed in 4 Ds. First of all, first D stands for declare that there will be no forced strike, no forced use. Second D is about de-alert. So take off most of the warheads from the high alert status, de-alert. Third one is deployment. Now reduce most of the deployed warheads. Then lastly, then in terms of decrease the number of warheads, I think there are more than 10,000 warheads, nuclear warheads, possessed by the nuclear weapon state. We are suggesting that strongly that it should remain below 2,000 altogether, with Russia and the United States respectively less than 500. Then it will be safer and immediately engage in reinstating this INF.
I appreciate you putting that perspective. I would add that President Obama did 4 global nuclear security summits, and hardly anyone remembers he did them. So they may have been substantively important, but they have evaded institutional memory somehow. Akam? Just
very briefly, respect. I think we forget that the United Nations essentially is the member states in their multiplicity, in their divergent interests and not united, that ultimately define the value of the United Nations. So if we are looking to a 75th anniversary, I think one of the things we have to do is remind ourselves why we created this institution and why it needs to be respected in its charter, in its norms. It's not a supermarket where you serve yourself one day and ignore it the other day, because this is what has undermined the United Nations and damaged it so often. Double standards, hypocrisy. You cannot instrumentalize this institution at will. And I think when people rediscover that, then they will also ask of their governments of the member states that sit in New York, represented within the Security Council, the General Assembly, respect that which the Charter was written for, and you will have a United Nations that will also deliver.
Thank you so much. Rosemary?
Yes, I agree with Akim on the issue of respect, but I would add another word to it, and that's justice. Justice, and what kind of justice? You know, erasing inequalities, accountability for atrocities. I mean, this is something that has to be front and center. And I do think that we are frequently criticized and looked at as a rather imperfect institution because of the lack of justice that we seem to represent.
Vladimir.
Very briefly, trust and confidence, key words absolutely for the current, to overcome the current difficult situation of the organization, but also, again, to look at the roots of the organization. It's very important in critical periods to remind ourselves that the current structure is a product of different forgotten compromises. We need to restart discussion about how to revive, how to restore the spirit, the letter, and the work of the organization.
Thank you. Very, very important.
Very briefly, inclusiveness. Inclusiveness at the national level and inclusiveness in terms of global governance. And that's why we feel the time is ripe to look at, not necessarily next year, but soon, really how to put inclusiveness back in global governance so that the kind of recommendation we are making to have a World Summit on global governance and reimagining how the structures of the global institution will actually serve the needs of the people so that the preamble of the Charter will really get meaning with the peoples of the United Nations.
Fabrizio.
Yeah, obviously, I echo everything that has been said, but just to add to the list, I think reconnecting with our founding values. In times of realpolitik, of heavy power politics, there's a temptation to duck below the wall and keep one's head down. I think now we should unapologetically uphold the norms and values upon which UN action is based, in particular the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but also the charter-based ideals of social justice, peace and security. And then I think we need to connect better with youth. I mean, most people agree that we are at a watershed moment in human history, by virtue of new technologies, by virtue of the evolution of geopolitics. And we need, if we are to transition, to be inclusive in terms of bringing youth in and listening to them and trying to live up and change according to those aspirations. And that's what we want to do. That's how we want to mark UN 75. And we really hope for all your help with that process.
Thank you. I wanted to take questions from the audience, but I've told that we have a time restriction that I need to adhere, so we're not going to be able to do that. So I'm going to finish. First of all, this has been a wonderful discussion. I want to thank, it's not often that 7 panelists can interact so well, so quickly over so much terrain. But I want to go back to the Secretary General last year, because there was one element, we touched on it a little bit, but not perhaps as much as I would like if we're reimagining a United Nations that matters for the future. He said last year, in his comments on this stage, genetic engineering can cure diseases, but it can produce monsters, i.e. CRISPR babies, etc. The internet is essential to our lives. I think it will be impossible for most of us to live without the internet helping us as much as we do, but there's also a dark web of a haven for terrorists, international criminal networks, and those profiting from sexual exploitation and abuse. I would also say, editing this, that what we've seen in Xinjiang in China is absolutely horrific. What we've seen in the use of internet by hate groups within the United States and elsewhere around the world and populist movements, these are areas that the United Nations has not played as much of a role in. So Fabrizio, I hope you get your wish there. Artificial intelligence will help power economies achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. It will be a fantastic instrument to generate wealth and profit in the world, but at the same time we will face tremendous disruption in the labor markets. There will be an enormous amount of jobs created and then an enormous amount of jobs destroyed. They will not be the same. It will be very difficult to recycle people. I find these important because as we get into a moment of celebrating the contributions and success of the United Nations, as we ponder, I think it's very important to look at what lays out there. So I want to thank all of you. Please give a big round of applause to Ibrahim Gambari, Ban Ki-moon, Rosemary DiCarlo, Tijani Mohamed Bande, Vladimir Voronkov, Fabrizio Hochschild, and Achim Steiner. Thank you all so much.